Russia will not lower its economic growth forecast for 2026, even though it had planned to do so due to massive budget deficits. This decision is linked to a temporary increase in oil revenues amid the conflict in the Middle East. Bloomberg reports this. Thus, the Russian government no longer sees the need to significantly cut federal budgets in order to replenish the deficit reserve fund. At the same time, Russia's Ministry of Finance stated that spending on financing the war against Ukraine may even increase. Analysts note that this appears to be a sharp shift in position compared to what was being discussed just a month ago. Back then, the Russian authorities were considering a more pessimistic scenario of lowering the economic growth forecast due to increased sanctions and falling oil prices. According to the agency's estimates, if the average price of Urals oil rises to $75 to $80 per barrel, this could bring Russia an additional approximately 4 trillion rubles in oil and gas revenues. We will be discussing this topic with our guest. Ivan Ust, PhD in economics and associate expert at the Analytical Center United Ukraine, is joining us. Ivan, hello, we're glad to see you.
Greetings to you, Natalia, and greetings to everyone watching.
Ivan, I would like to get your take on this. How do you see the situation? Is it really feasible for the Russian Federation to avoid increasing their tax burden? Or rather, their general state revenues, while at the very same time not reducing any funding for the most vital and essential sectors of their domestic economy, and yet still somehow counting on seeing substantial and healthy financial profits? Is that really the case, considering that events in the Middle East could end at any moment, and not to mention that the oil market could stabilize due to other resources, possibly other transportation aspects? How do you see it?
You know, Natalia, it seems to me that this is a classic example of counting your chickens before they hatch. That is, it's still unclear how long this will last, but Russia has already factored into its, let's say, economic development forecasts that this will be a prolonged conflict, there will be prolonged tension, and accordingly, there will be a long period of high prices for hydrocarbons. And Russia will have no problem selling these hydrocarbons, earning huge amounts of money, those trillions of rubles you mentioned. But first of all, let's say that even escalation in the Middle East, even the fire control that Iran has over the Strait of Hormuz, does not mean that Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates cannot supply oil to the world market for one simple reason. They have diversified routes for transporting their oil. Saudi Arabia, for example, has ports on the Red Sea on the other side. That is the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, is the Gulf that we call the Persian Gulf. But in the Arab world, it is called the Arabian Gulf. And on the western coast, there are ports on the Red Sea and oil pipelines lead there as well, which makes it possible, not completely, but to redirect part of the oil that would have been shipped by tankers to the ports on the Red Sea and from there through the Suez Canal and onto Europe. This particular strategic option has already been carefully calculated and considered. As for the United Arab Emirates, it is important that I take a moment to remind you of the specific geography of the region. The United Arab Emirates are also not positioned entirely as helpless hostages to the constraints of the Gulf, since they possess the Emirate of Fujairah, which directly faces the Gulf of Oman. This location is situated on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, which in turn opens out directly into the vast Indian Ocean. So it is already being said that the United Arab Emirates will simply redirect oil flows from ports on the Gulf to ports in the Emirate of Fujairah, and accordingly will also not be dependent on the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So here you have two major players in the region who turn out to be independent of the Strait of Hormuz and the risks that occur there. Next, here we are talking about oil prices and the capabilities of the countries in the region. The capabilities of countries outside the region have not been restricted by anyone. And Europe, for example, mainly receives hydrocarbons from African countries such as Algeria and Nigeria. And there are no problems here. Algeria is located on the Mediterranean Sea, so transporting oil across the Mediterranean is entirely possible. There are projects for constructing oil pipelines along the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not sure they will be implemented quickly, but that's also an option. Accordingly, a signal can be sent to the markets saying that we are accelerating their construction, and this will have a positive effect on them. Australia and the United States can also supply resources. This is especially important in the field of liquefied gas, which the US supplies because here, in fact, Qatar is the third country in the Middle Eastern region that is a significant player alongside Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Qatar, in particular, is completely dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. And here, the impact on gas is more significant than on oil. But as I said, the US can compensate for this. Again, these are global trends. As for domestic Russian issues, in order to realize the opportunities they have and the forecast given by the Kiev School of Economics about an additional $250 billion they could earn from this rise in oil prices, but for that, all capacities need to be operating at 100%. This is reported not just by the Ukrainian, but by the international press as well, that Ukraine has already damaged 40% of Russia's hydrocarbon export capacity. So it seems that Russia does have hydrocarbons, but they can only sell about 60% of them, since 40% of the capacity has been damaged. And by the way, Ukraine is not stopping, just for the record. So for this reason as well, Russia might not get the profits they have counted on, just like they prematurely claimed the capture of Kupiansk. But just as Kupiansk turned out not to be Russian at all, the oil profits they factored into their calculations are also unlikely to become reality.
As they say, a budget sequester can always be done at any time of the year, so to speak. But then, what gives the Russian Federation such confidence? Could it really be something in the White House by chance? For example, Bloomberg reports that the team of US President Donald Trump is already analyzing the consequences of oil prices surging to as much as $200 per barrel. Supposedly, this scenario is being considered amid the risks of war escalation. Although, of course, publicly the administration notes that such prices seem unlikely, nevertheless, Bloomberg later calculated that these figures are quite possible if the war in Iran drags on until June. After all, according to analysts, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for such a long time, prices will have to be raised in order to, well, offset part of the global demand. Are these really the extraordinary price figures that could be expected for a single barrel of oil? And what exactly could cause this to happen? And is the White House thoroughly evaluating and analyzing such scenarios correctly and taking them into account?
You know, Natalia, the question here is interesting in the sense that last week I presented my report on the state of the Russian economy at the Expert Council of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And when I justified some figures by saying that this is what Bloomberg reports, I heard a rather curious interpretation of Bloomberg's numbers when I was told, haven't you ever thought that Bloomberg very often publishes the numbers that Russia needs? And it's no coincidence that many people who are responsible for the hydrocarbon market, or rather for Bloomberg, are now working in Russian companies. This is to say that the figures Bloomberg provides are quite possibly the very numbers that Russia wants to communicate to the global public through Bloomberg. And when this is done through such leading global publications, and there is no doubt that Bloomberg is one of the main, if not the main, business outlets in the world, people pay attention to it. Therefore, there are undoubtedly risks. You can't say that it couldn't skyrocket. But you know, let's just look at the dynamics of oil prices. We've already had a whole month and even one day of escalation in the Middle East. The first week saw a slight increase in prices, but the situation was under control. The price was $85 per barrel. The second week, on the contrary, there was a spike in oil prices, and at one point the price rose to $119.6 per barrel. This was on Tuesday of the second week. And what happens next? After that, prices started to fall. Moreover, this morning, oil prices were at $107 per barrel. So right now, we're basically entering the fifth week of escalation in the Middle East. And if in the second week prices were 119.6, then in the fifth week they are 107. This indicates that in principle, the trend of rising oil prices was halted, partly because if we recall the forecasts made for the current year, they stated that in none of the 4 quarters of 2026 is demand for oil expected to exceed its supply. Yes, supply has now decreased, so perhaps we shouldn't rule out the possibility of demand exceeding supply. But firstly, alternative scenarios still exist. No one has canceled them. For example, Saudi Arabia's oil pipelines to its ports on the Red Sea and the United Arab Emirates ports in Fujairah, as well as other suppliers. So the panic that was driving up global oil prices seems to me to have quieted down a bit now. And going forward, of course, much will depend on how the situation develops around Iran, because the United States has, in principle, deployed quite significant forces to the region, and they have not yet, as they say, entered the game. And when they do enter, then we will see whether the US can actually accomplish what they intended but failed to do during the first week. Although, again, geopolitics is such a thing. Let's not forget that economically, those who suffer the most from this kind of situation are the ones who were primarily receiving resources from the Middle East. And those resources were primarily going to China. Accordingly, China is now suffering more. And for the United States of America, this situation could actually be very advantageous in the long term, since China is earning less money. For the first time since 1991, China has abandoned its strategy of annual growth of 5% or more. Now, they are saying that 5% and above is no longer going to happen. Accordingly, China is already slowing down its development, and this, of course, serves the interests of the US, since China is their main rival on the international stage. Therefore, for the US, any economic difficulties for China are essentially beneficial, just as difficulties for the US are beneficial to China. That's just the reality of competition in international markets. Nevertheless, let's see, but I still think these Bloomberg forecasts don't quite reflect reality. As for the White House, I agree that they either didn't fully calculate all the consequences or they did and were satisfied with them. Let's not forget that scenario either. But again, everything will depend on how events unfold at the beginning of April this year.
Yes, with some of their statements, they are certainly muddying the waters, as they say, but there are also analysts who believe that someone is deliberately profiting from this, using statements, including those of Donald Trump. But as they say, time will tell. Now, I would also like to talk about what the Russian Federation is planning. Yes, it will not lower its economic growth forecast for this year. By the way, I also think that it influences something like that. It's just probably for some kind of guideline somewhere in the banks, and even then, no one really looks at it. Here's regarding another solution. Russia is introducing a complete ban on gasoline exports for at least 4 months. This decision was made due to the acute fuel shortage within the country. The reasons for the shortage: Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries in the Russian Federation, which have significantly reduced production. Also, some Russian enterprises cannot operate at full capacity due to Western sanctions and the lack of equipment. The ban on gasoline exports means serious losses for the country's economy, analysts note. The Russian Federation is losing part of its foreign currency earnings. This in turn reduces budget revenues, which means less money is available for the war against Ukraine.